Ms. Meisteress, and we're here this evening to have a presentation done with Mary Walter. And she's going to be explaining to us how our taxes are affected and are used, and the process of the budget and so forth here in Claremont. I'm going to stand down for expertise, and hopefully we learn. This is the third in a part of a series that we've been conducting so that we can better educate ourselves as citizens and individually, so that we can move forward and help our city leaders help us. Okay? So what we're going to do is get started. I'm going to turn it over to Mary, and then after, Bernie will field some questions and so forth if you have any other. Yeah. Okay. And he even grew a beard for us, so that's good stuff. All right, I'm going to step over here and get out of your way. Turn it over to you.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. I was asked if I would give a presentation on the budget with the structure and the mechanics and the procedures that we use at the city. There is a handout for everybody, and most of you will be able to read the entire thing as we go along, but it'll give you a chance to write down questions if you have any, or highlight anything that you might see that interests you and you want more information on. So the agenda for tonight is we're going to talk about some laws and rules and guidelines, the definition and explanation of what funds are, understanding our budget, what it does and doesn't do for us, a process overview of how I arrive at revenues and expenses, capitals and grants, and our budget cycle all the way through to approval. And after that, we'll have some question and answer time. In New Hampshire, we must have a municipal budget. It has to be passed by law. The laws are set by DRA. There are codes and rules that we have to follow, and accounts that have to be in the same similar format that DRA puts into their Rules 1700. Both parts have to be consistent with the state's uniform classification of accounts, and ours are. What you see in the budget book that I do is segregated according to department, but when I roll up all of those figures, I actually put them into the DRA's account codes to marry up with what they have for rules. My directors are probably saying, oh, the budget. There's nothing worse than doing the budget every year. And believe me, they have struggled. The last month, that's all that all of them have been doing. You can understand why those that have to prepare the budget for me and give me all the figures that they want in their next year's proposals aren't really enamored with it, because it certainly is not as fun as doing the projects that they want to do within that budget. It's not really their bailiwick to do that. Police protect, DPW cleans potholes and roads and ditches, and numbers are numbers. That's finance. So it's a lot of work for them right now, and it's time-consuming for them, and that's what they've spent the last month working on. I see it as the most important document that we have in the community. It's the one thing that sets aside what we're going to do, where our resources are going to be allocated, how we're going to spend our money, what projects we're going to get done, what's a priority for our community. I call it right-sizing the government each year. The budget's the financial plan. It shows how much money is going to be available to us. The preparation of the budget is the responsibility of the city manager. He's the one who gives the council the proposed budget. The adoption of the budget is the responsibility of the governing body. In Claremont's case, that's your city council. So even though the city manager makes a proposal, the council has the ultimate authority as to whether we add more to the budget or whether we make additional cuts to the budget. But the budget in the end is a tool for implementing the policies that are adopted by the governing body. It provides me with financial and operational direction. It facilitates our decision-making, and it controls the activities and expenditures that the government has. A well-defined, sound budget is an indispensable component of an economical and efficient local government. So everything that we do at the government level, at the city government level, is based off that budget, and hopefully it's passed before the beginning of the new year, which is July 1st. Every municipality, these are the requirements, has to prepare, adopt, and operate with a budget. And we're required to have the operating and capital funding and the costs. If you have a planning board, you also have to have a capital improvements plan. Each year, which we just got done doing, the capital plan is integrated into the current budget, and then last year's is dropped off and a new year is added on. And that process goes to the planning board. The planning board approved it in February. I had brought it to council in March, and the directors will add all of those items that are into the current year capital plan into their budget requests. That does not mean that council is going to adopt that amount because they have final authority. It doesn't even mean that it'll make it past the city manager's budget, but it is what they have approved that we need going forward. The adoption of the budget, there's a public hearing on the budget where citizens can give public input prior to the budget being adopted. You have to keep in mind that this is only the municipal portion of the tax bill, and that's where a lot of people get confused because they think that we do all of it. We do bill and we do collect, but we do not keep the money for the school or the county. Every other week, I think it is, we send about $500,000 in a check to the school, and once a year we send a check to the county for about $2.2 million. So, but we do collect all of it. This is the tax rate for the 2014 year. And if you look at, it's kind of small, but you do have the print here as well. If you look at this, this is the gross appropriations for the city. And that includes the water and the sewer and the TIF. And the water and sewer has user fees attached to that, so it's actually a wash. And over here, you'll see what the net amount that we raise on the tax rate is, and that's $10.4 million. And those totals are what give us that tax rate. The total amount of the schools local, the state school rate, the town rate, and the county rate all added together, and it gets divided by this assessed value down here, which is $6.89 million. So $689 million. But I always use this number to say, okay, so what is $1 on the tax rate? For every $689,000 that we either raise in expenses or we gain in revenue, it's $1 on the tax rate. So if you wanted to cut expenses and lower the tax rate by $1, you would have to cut $689,000 out of whatever budget you were working on, whether it's the school, the county, or the city. Staff works on the development of our department budget, and every department budget is submitted to me, and it was submitted by last Friday. That was the deadline to submit all the budgets. The governing body, which is the city council, will have the opportunity once we submit it to them, and that's due by May 2nd, to determine if the goals are achievable given the revenue or the time constraints, and to address any other issues related to the goals that they have. One of the things that the city council determined that they wanted to have was a focus on economic development, and I can't remember what else there was one other thing that they wanted to target. But economic development was their big focus. So I'm sure that that's one of the things that will show up heavily in the budget. Oh, I know, it was infrastructure. The infrastructure was another one that they had brought up as important to them. So those are two areas of the budget that, depending on what the department heads put in for, and when we review the total picture of what the bottom line of the budget looks like, we will be taking into account. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what is a fund. So a fund is a sum of money or the resources set aside for a specific purpose. In the private sector, you would sometimes see companies set up for legal liability purposes. There might be several companies set up under an umbrella, and they might do that for liability or for tax purposes. In the public sector, we separate activities, and they're accounted for in separate funds in order to show accountability. So we may have a specific revenue that's set aside that's legally restricted, like the COPS grant. We have 2 COPS grants and 3 SAFER grants. So we have 3 firefighters, 2 COPS, and 1 COP grant just barely ended. Those monies are all set aside for a specific purpose. So those would be separated to show that the revenue was spent only for its intended purpose. Any unspent amounts that are in governmental funds are usually reported as either restricted, committed, or assigned. So if I have purchase orders at year end that have not been paid yet, those would be committed projects. If I have restricted money because of a grant that hasn't been completed yet, that would be restricted, so they would show up in different contingency funds. The general fund is all activity that has not been assigned to a specific individual fund is accounted for in the general fund. So the general fund is where we actually get the tax rate set, because all the other funds have to have offsetting revenues. The general fund is where everything else gets lumped into, and that's really where the budget is. It's where all my department funds are. And I show that when I do the budget, you'll see that the police department will have a budget of $2.3 million, and they may have $400,000 in offsetting revenue. You'll see that when I do the budget presentation. I will show what the actual net cost is to run the police department. Because to me, that's when I first came to Claremont, personnel costs were all lumped together. They weren't part of the department budget. So you could see everybody's health benefits, dental benefits, their personnel costs, they were all in one area. And I broke them all apart so that they're all in the department budget, so that you know what it costs to run the police department or the library. If you didn't have it tomorrow, what would you save? So as a result, most people will find the general fund is the most important fund, and that's the fund that contains all the uncommitted resources that can be used for general purposes. So when you're making tax cuts, that's what we're looking at, is the general fund. These are the types of funds that we have. We have a general fund, special revenue funds, debt service funds, capital project funds, and permanent funds. We also have proprietary funds, and those are based off user fees, and that's where the water and sewer sits. Internal service funds, and then we have fiduciary funds. Those are held by the trustee of trust funds. And we also have, the trustee of trust funds holds all of our trust funds as well as the school's trust funds. And all of these are audited every year. So that brings us down to what is fund balance. So a fund balance in basic accounting tells us that our assets are things we own, liabilities are amounts that we owe to somebody else, and the difference between those assets and liability is equities. In the government funds, that equity is called my fund balance. So people will ask me, is the fund balance available to be spent as the governing body sees fit? Kind of, maybe, not necessarily. We have certain levels of fund balance, and I report them according to how constrained they are. So you'll see that we have non-spendable assets. We have restricted assets. We have committed, assigned, and unassigned. The governing body has the authority to recommit or reassign fund balance. So if I have a purchase order and it's for a contract with the water sewer plant because they're doing upgrades, I can't get out of that. I've signed a legal document. It's going to require me to pay those funds. Those cannot be reassigned. If I have, I guess I assigned, I'm trying to think of something that would be assigned. Alan, give me an example.
You're in the middle of a lawsuit and legal funds, perhaps, that are upcoming or that you didn't get to spend in 1 year.
Yep. So if I have legal funds set aside for $30,000 in a purchase order, I haven't really spent them. I know they may cost me that. I can close out that purchase order, and that money would drop into an unassigned condition. That's a good example. Thank you. So in understanding the budget, our budgets serve a different purpose in the government than they do in business. In the business, your business plan and your budget is something that you're shooting for. You can do an aggressive plan. It may or may not be likely to be achieved, but you can set that up and you can price your widgets accordingly. In the government, the expenditure side of my budget is called my appropriations. And that's the legal authority for management to provide a given level of services. So it's based on a different premise than it is in your business. It's actually illegal for me to spend more than the budgeted appropriations, which is why we went to council last month to say we might be over in highway, streets, and roads. The budget appropriation is not a forecast of the amount that the city expects to spend. And that's important. It is not a forecast of the amount we expect to spend. It's the maximum amount that we are allowed to spend. So don't misinterpret the results of my year-end finance report when I say I might have $300,000 left in my bottom line of a $15 million general fund budget. Because I always say that most departments cannot spend down to zero at the end of the year. They work all year. Sometimes if they think, like DPW right now, they're going to be short salt and sand, they're holding off on other projects that they may do to try to save as much money as they can, knowing we've had a really bad winter. But so at the end of the year, if they haven't done those projects, they have a lot of money left in fund balance. Or like welfare is another example. We had budgeted that amount. She may not use the $170,000 that we have in rents this year. Yay for her, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't budget it because every other year we've needed it. So we're not trying to sandbag you when we say that by saying that we're asking for more than we need. We're just following the law. We're trying to stay within the budget and not spend over. And that money at the end of the year, it's not like it goes away, it drops back into fund balance. So what does it mean to have a balanced budget? My budget's considered balanced if my projected ending fund balance is positive. In any one year, it may be appropriate for me for my expenditures to exceed my revenue, and indeed this year it should, because we appropriated $268,000 out of fund balance. So I'm appropriating money from fund balance. $150,000 was for roads, and $118,000 was coming from money that we received back in health insurance premiums from the LGC lawsuit, and that money is offsetting contracted increases on a collective bargaining agreement that we signed. So it's helping defer the tax rate for the taxpayers. When we get ready to do the municipal budget, it should contain things like the budget message, the actual revenues and expenditures from the last fiscal year, what we actually have spent to date, as it'll probably be as of March, the estimated total revenues and expenses for the total, and the estimated total revenues and expenses for next year's budget. And those should all be in one format, and they typically are every year. I think that the budget message is one of the most important sections of the document. It's a narrative portion. It's one that the city manager does. It gives an overview of the key issues, the assumptions and priorities for the upcoming year. And we talk about what the budget is based on. It identifies any financial, economic, and inflation rates that are coming, anything that we see from the state level that we need to worry about. And right now there's a lot we need to worry about, and we'll probably be talking about that during the question and answer session. And it's an easy to understand tool for the citizens. It's readable. Like I said before, the budget, I think, is the most important financial planning tool that we have. It's how we shape what direction we're going in. It's where our priorities lie. And we always try to answer the questions of how does the activity funded fit in with the community's overall goals and objectives. I like to identify whether a department request is a need, a want, or a desire, because they're putting in what they want to run their department. And then, is the level of service that we're giving to people sustainable over the long run? And I think that's the point that we're at right now, is what is sustainable. When I get ready to do the budget, I start with the revenue portion of it. I believe it's best to err on the side of caution and underestimate my revenues rather than overinflate them, because then you have a false tax rate. So I could very easily say I'm going to take in $2 million more than what I think I am, because it makes it look like the tax rate's going to be lower than it really is. But when it comes time to actually set the tax rate and I don't have those revenues, all of a sudden you have a grossly exceeded property tax rate that wasn't what I told you it was going to be. And estimating how much money is going to be available is one of the most challenging parts of preparing the budget. A lot of our revenues are pretty stable, but there are some that are very hard to predict. And a couple of years ago, I had that problem when we had revenue sharing taken away from us, because I typically take in about $5 million in revenue, somewhere between 4.8 and 5.2, depending on what we have. My revenue sharing was almost $500,000. So that was a big chunk to come out of the revenues. And like I said, when you're talking $689,000 as a dollar on the tax rate, that swing is huge. Trying to make that up is very difficult. And we weren't the only ones that were impacted. The retirement system, the state used to pay us 35%, and everybody says it's old news, but you can't make those numbers up. And they keep coming every year because now I'm paying 100% and not having any sharing of that revenue like we used to have. So we have revenues that fall into different categories, and I look at what are ongoing and what are one-time. The ongoing ones are good that I can use against it. One-time ones, we try to only do one-time projects with one-time revenues. And then we have restricted ones, which I talked about earlier with the grants. Those are restricted incomes. Drug forfeiture money, when the cops do a big drug bust and they sell off the assets of a house, those are restricted monies, and they have to go into a separate account, and they're actually audited by the feds for that. And most of our money comes from either local or state sources, and we do get some federal monies as well. So the local sources we get franchise fees. So CCTV is funded through franchise fees from Comcast. They're rented the use of the public right-of-way, and there's a lawsuit on that too, so we have lots of lawsuits going on. We get interest income. It's very variable. Right now it's practically nil. We get motor vehicle fees, which is similar to a property tax on vehicles. This represents about 30% of the city's non-property tax revenue. We bill that out of our department, and we take in about $1.4 million. So that's almost double what it costs to run the whole finance department, including water and sewer and all the other collections that we do, just from motor vehicle fees. We get fines and forfeitures. That's money mainly available from ordinance violations. So when we talk about revenue and how can you lower that tax rate, one of the things that you can do is have more local revenue. How do we get more local revenue? This is one of the things I talk about, is you can be more diligent about fines and forfeitures, because even though it might be a $30 fine, you get stopped for speeding. Where's the money go? You pay a $30 fine or an $84 fine. Where's the money go? Who knows? State. We get none of it. So you're paying the police officers, you're paying for the cars, you're paying for the road coverage, but you're not getting any of the money. So, and most of the fines are like that. DWIs, all of that money goes directly to the state. What we get is local ordinances. So skateboarding on the sidewalk, local ordinance, there's a fine attached. You get stopped for that, the money comes to us. So those are the things. Assessing. You don't have your ticket up there. It's up to a $250 fine. If you don't have your, your numbers on the side of your house where it can be read by the fire department, $250 fine. That would come to us. And I say those kind of things because we do have people that still don't have 911, and I think that happened in almost 15 years ago that we passed that. And there's still people that don't identify it. And we have a lot more new firemen. So, you don't want them going to the wrong house because your house isn't clearly marked. Anyway, a little off topic. We get business licenses. We do get to keep that. That would be like permits in the park, the Speedway. They pay a fee every year. If you have a junkyard, a licensed junkyard, we get to keep that revenue. Permits and fees are planning and zoning, building fees. We get to keep those. It's quite variable according to whether there's been economic activity or not. Cemetery fees, opening and closing of fees, of the graves, the cost of the lot, the perpetual care. They actually bring in quite a bit of the cemetery income. I'm pretty sure it's like $60,000 total of their budget, which is a couple $100,000. So that's pretty well good return. Management fees, we do charge the enterprise funds for overhead expenses, and that would be accounts payable, payroll, collections. There's a certain amount of money that water and sewer pays to the general fund to offset some of those costs. And then we have your user fees, which are your enterprise fund, utility, water, and sewer bills. They're all generated and paid for by the revenues that are generated by the people that use them. And they can't be used by the general fund, by the way. We have borrowed from water and sewer in the past, and we have to pay them back at 0.25% above prime. So we haven't had to do that since we switched to the fiscal year, and the quarterly billing. Cash flow has increased tremendously, so that saves the taxpayers money. We also get a significant amount of money from grants. We get state and federal grants, and staff is very good at applying for grants. They've been fairly successful at receiving them. Most of the grants require a local match, and we often have grant and loan combinations. Some of the ones that we have used are the Community Development Block Grants, the CDBG, LCHIP grants, the Moose Conservation Plate Fund, the Department of Justice, Homeland Security. We've gotten a lot of grants in there for fire and police. And typically there are requirements that you have to do with documentation and accountability for all of those. But they offset the amount of the budget, so we're able to do projects that we might not have otherwise been able to get done. Some grants are so small and so onerous that the grant is sometimes more trouble than it's worth. And it comes with a lot of extra work and accountability, but you know, we try to get as much as we can. And over the past several years, we've received over $15 million in grant revenue. And although this is small, if you can see your sheet of paper, you can see all of the different things that we have gotten grants for over the past, this is probably 8 or 10 years. But we would not have been able to do a lot of these projects. And the two biggest ones, the two biggest ones are North and Main, which is just starting. It's in engineering phase right now. That will be going out to bid, I believe, next year. But that's $3.5 million, and we put in, I believe, an $800,000 local match to that, which we've already funded. And then Draper's Corner, which we just finished, that was $2.6 million, and I think we put in $600,000 or $700,000, or no, maybe $500,000 on that one. Main Street reconstruction, there's almost $500,000 that we have yet to do, and I'm afraid that it's going to come into we're going to end up doing that reconstruction just before we start North and Main, which will divert all of the traffic from North and Main to Main Street, but at least it'll be a better road than it is now. We've helped Pleasant Valley Estates extend their sewer. We've helped Women's Supportive Services with a building renovation, Crown Point Cabinetry with job creation. So there's been a lot of work that we've done to get these grants and to help not only ourselves. One of the things is a new boiler at City Hall, $152,000 we received through an ERA grant. We would have had to replace that boiler. It was almost 50 years old. So that would have been squarely on the tax rate, and instead we got it through a grant. Once I get done with the revenue portion of what I have to do and work on that part of it to figure out what we may or may not still have available to us in in revenue, I move on to the expense side. So the departments have just given me all of their budget requests, and they base their budgets based on keeping the same level of service that they have from the year before. So since you rarely see a decline in costs, it's increasingly difficult to maintain that same level of service while trying to level fund the tax rate. And that's typically what Guy has tried to do. One of my budget directives has been to level fund the tax rate. So over a number of years, we've level funded or gone to no more than 3% on the tax rate. So, but a decline in anticipated revenues or a decline in property values is going to drive up that property tax rate if you expect to keep the same level of service. And over on the side, you'll see that I have a little note in there that says the fluctuations in the revenues projected, the state budget or the economy can lead to a budget freeze on the approved budget. So Maggie Hassan put out her budget in February. They're working through the process now. It won't be passed until, I believe, sometime in early June. And at that point, we may need to react very quickly, depending on what we may or may not get for meals and rooms tax is the biggest revenue source that I have right now, and that's almost $625,000. So that's close to $1 on the tax rate. If there's a cut in meals and rooms on what we expect to get for next year, that can drastically affect what we do with the budget. So in my expense side, I have operating expenses, and generally they're ongoing, they're rather than one-time expenses. Some of since our municipal services are people intensive, usually it's my cost of my wages, my salaries, and my benefits that are the greatest cost for most cities and towns, and Claremont is included. Claremont, like more larger communities, has collective bargaining agreements, and we have them with 70% of our full-time workforce. and collective bargaining agreements dictate what we do with our workforce. So the wages, the benefits, and even changes in language, once it's been granted, are very difficult. It must be bartered out of their contract. So we went almost 5 years without an agreement and a contracted agreement because we were trying to get them to pay part of the health insurance costs. And 5 years, there was like no movement at all. So increases are difficult to take back. It's a very personal matter. And the obligations continue far into the future. So we have to be very careful of what we do with collective bargaining agreements. And the changes are especially tough with we belong to the New Hampshire retirement system. And we were told when we joined the New Hampshire retirement system that if you give us your money and you join our system, we will pay 35% of the fire and police costs, and we will share that cost with you. And fire and police are high. They pay, I think we pay 26% of percentage in health insurance premiums for police and 29.1% for fire. And that's of every dollar. So you got to figure a quarter of every dollar that we pay the police, they get paid to the New Hampshire retirement system in their retirement benefit. And the fire department's 29%. Now they don't pay, we do not have to pay payroll taxes for them. So we save the 6.2% in FICA, and they don't have to pay that match either because they're paying a higher percent of their own money into that system. But it's still a lot of money that's added in that I don't have control over. And we have to pay any differences in the amount that it's underfunded. And you'll see the reports that they're at 56% funding, and I think they need to be at 80%. My rates are guaranteed for 2 years, so this coming year they're already set in stone until the next July 1st. But I suspect those numbers will be closer to 30 and 35% retirement contribution that we will be making because they need to start making up that gap. Other costs that we have to budget for are supplies, utilities, insurance, maintenance, communications, all the things that you would typically budget for in your own household. The most expensive functions of municipal government are my law enforcement, my fire protection, and my street maintenance, and this makes up almost 70% of all the taxes that the city collects. So when we're talking about budget cuts, if you're going to go to the places where the biggest dollars are spent, you're not going to take away your core essential services. So I have operating expenses that I have that are quite consistent from year to year, and I get to spend less amount of time on those. Not that I don't look at all of them, but if I suspect that I need energy and fuel costs, there's a lot of variation in that. Health insurance cost, they've increased more rapidly than inflation, and I just talked to you about the money that we pay out to New Hampshire retirement. So all of those things rapidly add up to a lot more money than what we typically end up giving to taxpayers in the finalized budget. Then we have the capital expenses. And as I just said, I just brought the capital to the council last month and the planning department in February. The amount of money that's targeted for this year on the tax rate would be 47 cents, I believe it is, if that was approved in the final budget. If you consider that 3% on the tax rate is 45 cents, that means that there's more in capital than what we would typically even give you as our budget. Operating expenses, when the director's requests are put into a master budget document, that's what I'm doing now. I'm going to focus more on our fixed costs first, what I have for debt service, what I have for contracted language in the collective bargaining agreement, what I have for utilities, insurance, salaries, health and dental, New Hampshire retirement system contribution, things like salt, sand, fuel for police, fire, and DPW. There's a lot of fuel costs. And then any legally required agreements like the monitoring of our landfill. So I'm going to look at all of those things first and put those numbers into the budget and see what I come up with for a bottom line there. And then I start adding employee wages and benefits. I'll go through them and find out if their wages are correct, whether we've hired new people, whether we've promoted people. because if somebody's going to get a promotion because they're going from a sergeant to a lieutenant next year, that means there's an increase in pay. And if they expect that on July or September or when their probation period ends, I have to know that to put those numbers into the budget. Have they changed their status? Has anybody gotten married? That can be a swing of $8,000 for that one person, going from a single to a two-person or a two-person to a family. So those numbers all swing the numbers very quickly. Are there vacant positions, and how are we budgeting for those? Are we going to be filling them next year, or can I leave it vacant, or can I not budget for it at all? And are there new positions being requested by any of the directors? So there's a lot of things that need to be taken into account when I sit down and start pulling all these numbers together. I'll analyze, verify, and calculate the expense costs, and this can take a long time since there are over 1,200 accounts that I have to review. And I have a little over a month to complete all of this work and present it to the city manager for review. So once that's done, we'll have a true bottom line request for the upcoming year. And then it comes to the task of determining what's a reasonable budget given the constraints of funding. So budgeting in the city never stops. And while I'm preparing our new annual budget, every department head is tracking and reviewing their current year's revenues and expenses. So right now they're looking at what they've got left to spend, what they still have for projects that they haven't done. As we implement the New Year's budget, I'm also beginning my audit cycle because the auditors will be coming in May and June to audit this year's audit. So I'm working with 3 different areas all the time. And so, you know, the preparation, approval, and implementation and audit review are ongoing all the time, especially for our area, but even for the departments, because they all are the ones that have to manage what they have to spend and how they're doing in keeping within their budget. We begin budget preparations in December and January, and that's with the updating of the capital improvements plan. The departments will all get worksheets to say, do you still want this plan? What are the new costs? Are you still anticipating doing it? Have you found any grant revenue to offset any of these costs? What kind of a priority is it to you? Is it a health safety issue? And all of those things are taken into account, and we go before the CIP committee, and then that's brought to the planning board. In mid-February, the departments begin developing their budget requests, and they'll get a big packet of information from me. They'll get their current wages, longevity, health benefits, what everybody's on, what I have in there for what they're making per hour. They need to verify all of those numbers. Then they need to build their budget request to me. And generally, they have to verify why they need that money. So if it's that they are planning on 28,000 gallons of fuel oil or $16,000 a month for lighting for the city, we typically pay $13,000 to $16,000 a month to light the city streets. So all of those things are put into that budget spreadsheet that they're going to send back to me. City staff will collect it, and it's finalized by the city manager, and we will give a proposed budget to the council 60 days prior to the end of the year, which is like May 2nd. Council will hold meetings during the month of May. Interested citizens can participate. The goal of the budget preparation is to balance all the revenues and expenses, prioritize our capital improvements, and appropriately manage our outstanding debt. So this is the budget process. 90 days prior to the beginning of the fiscal year, the departments have to submit their budget requests to the finance director. 60 days prior, the city manager must prepare the budget for each fund and submit it to the governing body. Budget hearings are held during the month the governing body receives the budget, and then publication and posting of the budget summary has to occur at least 1 week prior to the public hearing. And generally, those budgets are posted when we give them to the council, so it's a clear month before. And a public budget hearing has to be held prior to the final vote on the council on the budget. So the public budget hearing is when the public can weigh in as to their final voice before the budget is actually passed. I know your city councilors are pretty open to receiving input most any time, and I'm sure that they take your concerns into account when you're voicing them. The amendments, the budget can be amended by the resolution of the governing body. So unlike a town where you would have your town meeting in March and you have one voice then, in Claremont and in most of your cities, your budget can be amended throughout the year, as long as there's another revenue source once to take that from. So for me now, the budget will be passed by July 1st. In September, I'm setting the tax rate. No, October, I'm setting the tax rate. In September, I have to give them the new total of what I expect our revenue to be. Once I set that tax rate, we can't add money to the budget unless it's coming from a source like fund balance or a grant or unanticipated revenue. So we have to have another funding source in order to increase that budget. The fiscal year of the city and all of the funds is the fiscal year of July 1st to June 30th. On June 30th of each year, we determine the financial conditions showing a freeze frame in time of all the money flowing in and out of the city, our outstanding city debt, and the financing was needed for capital improvements. So the audit that is done is a freeze frame of what the city looks like for revenues, expenses, debt, and everything as of June 30th of each year. And that's what typically you will see, and the auditors just finished the audit in December and came in and did a council presentation to the council. We've had clean audits for several years. Since moving to the fiscal year, it's been improved our cash flow situation, our fund balance greatly. We're looking much healthier than we did look. And we adopt the new budget late in May to begin on July 1st of the new fiscal year so that we have everything in place and the departments know what their budget is going to be by the July 1st deadline. I say that the tips for a successful budget process is to be selective, that governments can't be all things to all people. People all have their own priorities of what they think is important and what's not important. We try to look at what core services and facilities are the most important for us to provide, and then balance that with what we can afford. Things that are tempting to do, but really you should not, is to inflate revenue estimates. I try very hard not to do that. Underestimate your expenditures. We try to balance that. Raid the reserves and the enterprise funds. Fail to repay any interfund transfers and defer costs to the future. I think that one of the things that I thought that maybe you guys would want to talk about is what would help, because how do we decrease the tax rate? And I started thinking about, all the things that I would like to see done, which probably isn't going to happen because it would take an act of Congress, and they're not playing well in the sandbox right now. But a different funding source besides property taxes, stopping the downshifting from the state, restore my revenue sharing, give us the legislatively approved share of meals and rooms. We could establish more user fees so that use of the non-essential services, the people that use them are the ones paying for them. And I know that the council was recently talking about the transfer station. We have 13,000 people in town. We have 6,500 properties. I think there's 5,400 that have houses or apartments in them. And about 200 people use the dump. So I have a budget of $200,000 and 200 people using it. So you have to kind of weigh that and say, is that a good use of your resources? And those are the things that, kind of need more looking at. Is it fair to make the people pay that are the ones using it? Because all of you that have your rubbish collected are paying that. You're not the ones going to the dump and dumping. Maybe fines and fees. We could up those. Maybe fire alarms or police alarms. Maybe we need to look at different costs for them. The police do a lot of calls to the same home or the same facilities. Maybe there needs to be a look at that to see if there's something that we can do, that you get so many calls because some of you never use these services, and some of them use them quite frequently. One of the things that I talked about was being able to praise in public and criticize in private, because we are a global world now, so everything you say can and will be used against you. So I would like to see us do more of that. If there's something that somebody sees us not doing well enough at, that we can talk about it. But when you start criticizing your own community, it makes it hard for other people wanting to come here. So being the cheerleader of what's good in your community, something that I think Michael was trying to start with the group of finding positive things and finding where we can improve things, is not necessarily a bad thing. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Anytime people say, can you explain it again? I'm not sure I understand it. What is the new program going to accomplish? We look at contracting the service out. Can we do that with the collective bargaining agreement that we have? Are there services we could outsource? Is this a program we could cut back on or even eliminate? And have we followed all the correct procedures with notices and hearings, et cetera?
Thank you, Mary.
I just have one more thing I wanted to show you, and this is the tax rate. I have kept records of the tax rate as far back as I could go in a spreadsheet, and I kind of keep this going every year. It shows you where we were at, what the assessed value is at the bottom. You'll see the assessed value and whether it's gone up or down. You'll see what the equalized assessment is, and you'll see what the tax rate is. And you'll see when the state started, the state education tax was in 1999. Back then they were paying $620 a thousand. This coming year it's at $272. So you can see, I think way back, I think the tax rate, the highest it was 61, 65, 77, $79.02 a thousand in 1989. And that's it.
Thank you, Mary. I think you've shown us the amount of complexity that this whole budget process takes. And I'm sure you've shed some light on the various components of that process, but also there are probably areas that maybe people still have some questions about, and I hope that's the case. I took a few notes. There are a couple of things I wish you'd say, but I won't do that now. I do have to say, though, on praise in public and criticize in private, have you heard the piece of political humor that goes, it's an important function of every government to give the citizens something to criticize? And then there's the one that goes, you can complain about the weather, but it's probably not going to do any good. You can complain about government, and if enough people do complain, it might do some good. So I know what you're saying. Stuff gets all over the internet, but there's humor too. So humor gets all over the internet too. Okay, Larry. Okay, well, I know most of you, but I'm going to ask for the television audience that you please identify yourself, name and ward if you want, with your question.
Okay, thank you. Larry Converse, Ward 2. And my question is, when we're seeing all this destruction in Claremont, does the tax rate on the building that's there now, before they tear it down, going to be the same rate that is at this moment? Or did I confuse you?
Let me answer it and see if you did or not. So right now, your taxes are assessed at another picture of time, and that's April 1st. So if your house existed as of April 1st, you're going to be taxed on it. If your house was torn down or it had a fire or was demolished by March 31st, that portion of that property is no longer on the tax rolls. So if your house was valued at $150,000 and your land value was $50,000, you should see an assessed value of $50,000 if the house is removed. Does that answer your question?
I believe it does, because Cumberland Farms, they're tearing their buildings down out on Washington Street. Does that mean it's not matched yet? So their taxes are going to be much lower on that piece of property at this point?
That's correct.
Who's next? Okay, I saw this hand first. Mr.
Francis Gothier, Ward 1. Thanks a lot, Bernie. And, I've got a question about, you say a new boiler is going into the City Hall. Now, that's kind of curious, because this hot water district is going to be coming in. Is it going to come in or not going to come in? Do you know?
Okay, so I just want you to know, that was an assessing question. This is an economic development question. I'm going to try to field all these, but,
Yep.
you know, don't hold me to God on it.
Yep.
So the boiler we got in was in 2010, I believe, and it was paid for with ERA funds, half of it. I think the cost total was over $300,000 to do all of City Hall. The Hot Zero, I just talked with them last week. They're waiting for approval materials from the PUC. Once that happens, I think they're all set now, but it has to go through governor and council and all of that stuff afterwards. And they will be tapping into City Hall. That is one of the ones that we have a very good, efficient boiler, and there should be room for them to target that. So that will help in the downtown configuration of where they get their power from.
Yep. The other question is there a plan all city buildings are going to be hooked to the hot water loop?
No. There's a plan to hook right now, to hook the library, fire department, and City Hall. The others are outside of the jurisdiction of it right now, maybe in a future phase.
So what's planning is the hot water district is going to be head up by a biomass?
That part I don't know.
Okay.
I know they plan on, I think the Union Block is one of the ones that's buying in. They have wood pellet. We have fuel oil. The fire department has solar, wood pellet, and fuel oil.
Yeah.
So they're looking for heat from a variety of sources.
Yep. Because what would be great to see here in Claremont, if you had a massive biomass plant and the city owned a chunk of it so they could sell heat out to the community, wouldn't that be great? Instead of citizens' money going to the oil companies, instead of being paid to the oil companies, you're paying it to the city to make a profit to lower the tax rate. Wouldn't that be great?
You would have to have enough income to do a bond to be able to afford that. So, and there are restrictions on the amount of money we can borrow.
But he would basically pay itself back.
Yes.
And lower
eventually.
your tax rate. Once you lower your tax rate, people are going to want to come to Claremont, not stay away.
As we mentioned on the mini poster, it was Q&A about the budget, but discussion as well. So don't feel you have to have questions on the budget, but hopefully we have some of those also. I saw you, sir, with your hand.
I'm Lloyd Mann. Mary, could you go back to your last slide on tax rates? And I see the equalized assessment goes up and down either above or below 100%.
Correct.
And I guess this year is the first time that it hit 100%. And how does that affect with the tax rate?
How does that happen?
Do they work together? Or?
Yes. So let's say that last year, if you had a house that was assessed for $100,000, you would actually, your value, if you were selling it, would be $85,000 because we were assessing over what your assessment was. So your assessment on your property tax card is $100,000, but your value, what we're saying is because Claremont's at 115%, your value of your property is actually only $85,000, and that's what DRA looks at. What's the equalized value? So they take market share. We have to submit all the sales that happened in Claremont over the past year, and those are submitted to DRA, and then DRA evaluates whether those were arm's length transactions or whether they were you selling to your son or daughter for a discounted rate or whether you were a foreclosure. Those ones are not counted in that. They take all of those and they come up with what's called the equalized value, and that's what they apply to that. So I think when 2001, when Guy first came here, even though we were at 99% back then, Washington Street was only at 70% or 72%. They were way out of whack compared to the rest of the community. DRA will allow you to go in and do what's called a community area reassessment, a revaluation of just that one area. He wrote and asked permission and got permission to go in and do Washington Street because it was so far under value. But at that point, if Walmart was assessed for $10 million and they were fighting their assessment, and they said, well, we're only going to be valued at $8 million, and they fought it and won, we would have to pay back the difference, not only at the $2 million difference in assessment, but then take that at 70%, because that's what their assessment was valued at. They were at 72% or something like that at the time. So we would have had to pay them back $3.3 million of assessed value, what the actual tax rate would be at that time. So we always want to try to be as close to 100% as you can. DRA allows you to be either at 90% up to 110%. So they don't care if you're within that 10% swing either way of 100%. When you start getting outside of that is when they start getting worried and really want you to go in and do a upgrade of your values. So right now we are at the 100%. We just had the reval. I'm guessing when Marlene and the assessing department gets done, we're going to start seeing a slight uptick, because sales are starting to come in, and they're actually coming in at slightly above what we have people assessed for. So we might drop to 99%. But it's going to stay pretty close to that 100%.
I don't know, I can't remember, Mary, whether you said earlier that DRA stands for Department of Revenue Administration.
That's correct.
Which is the state-level tax bureau. And we had a presentation by a representative on the tax setting process. I don't know if you were aware of that meeting. It was on CCTV. And if you wanted to see it, you could probably order a DVD of that DRA presentation that was here a few months ago. The other thing is they have, being an agency of the government, of New Hampshire government, they are on the state website. The state website is nh.gov, and under agencies, click on Department of Revenue Administration, and they do have quite a bit of material which further explains what their role is and how they interact with cities and towns. Someone else? Yes, sir.
In reference to the
Okay, can we get you to a mic?
excuse me for not getting up.
No, that's okay. The mic's
I'm as bad off as you. Roger Courier, Pleasant Valley Estates, West Claremont. Been a lifelong member of the city of Claremont, 84 years worth. Now I have a couple of questions in reference to the article in the paper. One being,
could you say what that article is?
yes, the CIP for fiscal year almost $2.5 million.
And which edition was that in?
This was Tuesday, March 17th,
In the Eagle Times?
St. Patrick's Day.
Eagle Times.
Now, my question is twofold with reference to almost $2.5 million as presented by the planning board, which is up a few dollars from last year. But by the same token, to offset the costs has gone down considerably. And the increase for the tax rate is $3.04 per $1,000.
Now, the increase of new items in the CIP. So what we do with the CIP is we present you with anything that's capital in the CIP. That total of your $15 tax rate amounts to $3.04 of the $15.11 that's the city's portion of the tax rate. So the new debt that we would be taking on is going to add 47 cents to the tax rate if all of that comes through in the budget in its final format.
It's very confusing, because one place it says it's going down, the other is $3. I didn't understand where it went or how it fitted into the overall budget.
So is that
Got
clearer to
two
you?
different numbers.
Okay, so the $3.04 is what the total debt that the city has for capital projects and capital items that we fund through the property taxes is $3.04 of the $15.11 that makes up the city portion of the tax rate.
Is that for the current year?
That's for the current, I don't know, I don't have the CIP in front of me, but I know that $3.04, I think that's the total for this coming year, if it all makes it in. Of that $3.04, let me just see if I have the CIP. Sometimes I have stuff on my thumb drive and,
Mary,
yes.
I have a paper copy.
Oh, good. Thank you. Great, Kyle. Thank you. Okay. So the current year, it's $2.53 of the current year, and next year it will be $3.04 total if everything passes.
It gives me a better idea.
Yep.
The other part of this question being, as an ongoing project, what is left over from last year? Where does that go? Or is there ever any leftover? Because in some agencies, if they have leftover money, they'll go out and buy anything so they don't have to turn money back in.
Right.
That's known as the use it or lose it syndrome.
And I don't want our directors to get into that. Sometimes when you start getting people that say you didn't use it, we're 3/4 through the year and you haven't used it, therefore you don't need it next year. I don't like doing that. We monitor everything. Purchase orders have to be approved by us. They have to go out for a process. We have had cases where we've asked the council to re-encumber that money. This year, that amount of money was $454,000.
No.
It's re-encumbered. So it's not raised again on the tax rate.
Now, use the word that we haven't heard before, encumber. Could you?
Explain encumbered. Okay. So you have projects that you've budgeted for, and they've been raised on your tax rate. And let's say it was to recarpet a room in City Hall. We didn't get time to do that, or we held off doing it because we were afraid that something else was going to be over budget, so we didn't put the carpet down. We still need the carpet. We've already raised it on the tax rate, so what we do is we go to council at the end of the year and say, I have these projects we still haven't done, and we'd like to do them next year, and will you approve us holding that money over so that we can do them next year? And council has been very favorable to that. If directors do not ask me for that, and it'll drop into fund balance. And so the money just goes into the savings account for the city. Sometimes it's reappropriated from fund balance the following year, but most of the time it's in fund balance, and that's where it stays.
Sometimes, in order to make things a little clearer, maybe, instead of fund balance, which is a technical term, I have used the word piggy bank.
Yep, savings account.
Yes, and I've heard the city manager use the term savings account.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then sometimes people want to know how much money is in the piggy bank or savings account.
And how much is a good money to have in it? How much is the right amount to have in it?
Kyle Messier, Ward 1. That would be my question. Can you tell us what the auditors were telling us that we as a community need in our piggy bank, our savings account, that's appropriate so that we have appropriate amount of money as a community in case something happens? I hear every year, I'm a city councilor, in case anyone doesn't know that, and we hear every year that we're going to drop $200,000 or $300,000 into fund balance, and that may sound like a lot of money to many people, but Mary can tell us what we're supposed to have as a community in our savings account, and it's
And I actually printed
quite a
out
bit
a
of money.
copy of that.
and
because
we get sort of demerits from the auditors if we don't have enough savings in our account. It's important that a community has savings.
So there are guidelines that are set by DRA, which is the Department of Revenue Administration in Concord. And then there are also guidelines sent by the Governmental Finance Accounting Board. And DRA says you should have between 5 and 10%, and GFOA says between 8 and 17%. So 5% of the city's budget that we should be holding aside and saving is $1.4 million. 10% is $2.8 million, 8% is $2.26 million, and 17% is $4.8 million. So we should at least have the 5% of $1.4 million. And at the end of June 30th, we had 2.9 million in fund balance. And that's another area that people keep questioning because there are two kinds of fund balance. In New Hampshire, we have property tax as pretty much the sole source of income. In most other states, you have a sales and an income tax and property tax. So New Hampshire has, I think we're number 46 out of 50 states in the amount of total taxes that the person has to pay. So we're like 46 out of 50. So the burden of the taxes is the lowest, pretty low in New Hampshire. It doesn't feel like that when you get your tax bill because in other states, you may have a property tax bill $800 a year or $1,000 a year, but you're paying sales tax and income tax on top of that. So I don't pretend, I just know that it is very difficult for people that own their own home, that have lived there for 40 years, that try to pay the property tax and use very little of the services. And I understand that burden is there. But on the other hand, people don't want to see 1.5 million in fund balance either. So DRA, because we have people pay their property taxes, they don't pay them, especially when we were on a calendar year. The bills went out in November. People had until December 1st to pay them. Most people did not pay by December 1st. Lots of them hadn't paid by December 31st. December 31st is my year end. So all of a sudden I have all of these property taxes that haven't been paid yet. In most other states, they pull that revenue, that anticipated revenue that you haven't received comes out of your fund balance. DRA in Concord does not do that. But GAAP, which is the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, does do that. So when they roll up my government-wide financial statements, they pull out what was my deferred revenue. So property taxes are collectible. We'll take your house if you haven't paid them. So I'm going to get it eventually, and I'm going to get it at 12 and 18% interest, which I can't make at the bank. So if you don't pay your taxes within 30 days, I'm now charging you 12% interest. And if you don't pay them within 30 days or 6 days, whatever the heck it is, 18% it jumps to. So it's a huge amount of money. And then we lien it. So you get lien fees on top of that. But DRA does not count that. So there's a discrepancy between what I have in my fund balance, which is really what we have that I could borrow from, because I could easily sell your accounts receivables of your taxes collected to some company at pennies on the dollar and get all my money up front, or most of it. So if I have to take out the revenue that is not paid at year end, that could be, I'm collecting $28 million a year is what I'm collecting out of property taxes for the school, the county, and the city. So out of that $28 million, if I don't have 10% of it, that's $2.8 million they're going to take out of the fund balance. So all of a sudden your fund balance looks like it's negative. It's not really negative, but that's what it looks like. So we always have this discrepancy between some people that say, oh my God, you're broke. We're not broke. You know, it's just the way that the timing is. It's better now because my year end isn't until June 30th. So at June 30th now, most people have paid their taxes because even the quarterly tax bill is due by March 31st. And since this is on CCTV, please remember that your tax bill, the last quarter, is due by March 31st, so it's coming up soon. So, you know, I have less of a chance. There are still some people that haven't paid their taxes, but it's a lot less. The quarterly tax bill has helped people. It's in a smaller increment, a smaller amount. So, you know, we've had some people that have paid both halves at the same time, even though they don't have to.
Someone else? Okay. Mr. Correa. Oh, and then...
One more thing with all this information, in all the municipalities within the state of New Hampshire, how can we justify having the highest tax rate in the entire state?
So your tax rate is based on what the value of your community is. So let's take Sunapee. They have 3,000 people in their community. What do you think their value is? They have a lot less roads than we do, 3,000 people to take care of, less fire, less police, less school. Their assessed value is almost 3 times as much as Claremont's. So therefore, their tax rate can be a third of what ours is. Lebanon's the same way. Any place, I always tell people, if you look at it and you say, if you're near a college or you're near a lake, or you're near a mountain, your assessed values are higher. The properties are worth more. So when your assessed value is higher, your tax rate is lower. That's the part that Steve was explaining to you. There's a huge swing, and you know, you can't make people buy your property for more than what they're willing to pay.
I just had an economic development idea. Dig a big hole someplace in Claremont, and we'll have Lake Claremont and raise the value of that development. Just kidding.
But it's really why you need to have the conversation of, is the property tax the right tax to have?
That's a political issue, of course.
It is a very political issue.
Next.
Larry Converse, Ward 2. On the county portion of this, it seems like it goes up and down, but the last 2 or 3 years, the county hasn't raised their rate up, but the city seems to be raising their portion of the rate. Could you tell me how that is figured?
So the city does nothing with the county's portion of the rate. That's set by DRA. So the county has their total budget, and I'm not 100% sure of the actual apportionment formula, but I know that they take the total value of all of Sullivan County, and then there's a percentage of that that has to do with the population, how many people you have that are paying into that, and what they need to run their county. And that percentage, I think Claremont was paying 22% of the county's budget. I think Sunapee pays 26% of the county's budget, even though they have 3,000 people. So, you know, because it's based on the ability of it's based on their assessed value of their community, I suspect that Claremont, because we just dropped our assessed value, that this year's county budget will drop as well, and those other communities will be paying a bigger share because Claremont's assessed value is down. So the total amount of Sullivan County will be apportioned up among all those communities. So it won't be a lot, but it'll be a little bit less than I'm guessing it will be, unless they go up on their budget.
I'm going to give you a number to remember from tonight, and it's not specifically on the county budget, which was just discussed, but Mary, you said that the assessed value is $689 million. And so $689,000 is $1 on a tax rate.
Correct.
Well, I'm going to round that to make it easy to remember. Let's call it, round it up to 700,000. So $700,000 of expenditure is $1 on the tax rate. So 1/10 of that, or $70,000, is 10 cents on the tax rate. And $7,000 is a penny on the tax rate. So keeping it sort of on even numbers makes it easy to calculate, I think, if someone says, oh, such and such a thing is going to cost this, say it's going to cost $140,000, you can say, oh, that's twice 70, so that's 20 cents on the tax rate. So if you remember the number rounded of $700,000 being $1 on the tax rate, you can kind of relate things to what the tax impact might be. Who's next? Let me see, any first timers? Okay. Oh, do we have a first timer?
I've already asked a question.
Okay, we'll go.
Thank you. Thank you. A while back, I was at City Council and he was talking about budget. It was budget season again, and
Go ahead.
okay, and a big question came up about you were getting ready to take properties for the first time in probably 10 years, and you were talking about trailer parks, and I sent some stuff into City Hall and I put an op-ed in the paper. What I understood from that is that when it comes to a trailer park, when somebody's not paying on their trailer, not paying their taxes, is like they're immune from that trailer being taken from them. Right? What I would like to see is the city being more vocal to legislature saying that we need to change the laws about that. I think the operator of the trailer park should be in default of that. So if their person who's living in the trailer doesn't pay their taxes, you go to the trailer park. They pay. So then it's up to the trailer park owner to be like a landlord and take him into court to get the money or get him evicted. You would, the way I understand it, it's almost like a plan. People sell their houses, move into a trailer park, so they stop paying taxes. Is there any truth to that?
I can't tell you whether there's truth to it, but I'm a suspicious kind of girl. And I would love to be able to bill the property owner. I don't care what you have on your land, but you're responsible for paying the taxes on it. And how you divvy it up is up to you, but that's not the law. So I can't do that. But trailer parks are their own problem, because generally by the time you get ready and aren't paying the taxes anymore, it's very hard to move the trailer off the park property. The park is not receiving rent either, so they're eager to get the property taxes paid by somebody. They'd like to move the trailer off, but we won't let them move it until they've paid the property taxes. And so you get into a vicious cycle of how do you stop it. In the meantime, that person just keeps living there. So I don't have the answer to fix that. I have asked that there be something there to fix it. I'm not sure they know at the state level of how to fix it. It is a statewide problem. I see it on my listserv threads between other communities trying to deal with what they do with trailer parks. So, and we don't have as many as some communities. I think Charlestown has a bigger percentage of trailer parks than we do.
Thank you, Bernie. Kyle Messier, can you, back to the tax rate, can you speak to, in simple terms, the concept of our tax bill versus our tax rate? So our tax bill, I understand, in the state of New Hampshire is quite average for the services we receive. And just because our tax rate changed this year, are people's tax bills changing that much this year?
Right.
You did a nice presentation on that to the City Council.
I did, and it's actually available on the website as well. It talks about the highest tax rate in New Hampshire or the highest tax bill. Our tax bill is actually average within the state of New Hampshire. We are a full-service community. We do have full fire, police, library services, community center. There's a lot of amenities here. You're close to hospitals, you're close to stores and shopping malls, and so we are a full-service community. We are in the average statewide. The average tax bill, I believe, is now up to $5,300 a year. So if you took your house and you put it up in Hanover or Lebanon or some other place, the assessed value would be significantly higher than it is here. But it does change your rate.
Not
So
the bill.
it changes the tax
I
rate.
think we understand as clearly in
Correct.
this community.
So we are about in the middle as far as your tax bill goes. We do have the highest tax rate. Now, the highest tax rate a lot of times scares away developers because they go online and they see this high tax rate. So, you know, we get phone calls and emails saying, well, if I do these renovations in the community, what's my new tax assessed value going to be? Because now all of a sudden they've made the connection, because the house may only be assessed for $70,000. I can get that for a bargain. You know, I can go in and I can flip it and sell it for $200,000. But what if I want to keep it and live in it? All of a sudden, if it's assessed at $200,000 and I'm paying $41 a thousand, my tax bill's quite high. So those are all the concerns that we shuffle and deal with every day, trying to bring development into the community. But 67% of the people in Claremont saw their tax bills go down with the revaluation. So 67%. So if you saw your tax bill go up, you're in the 1/3 that went up, not in the 2/3 that went down.
Just as a follow-on to that, there's another way to measure, and it's a concept called tax burden, and that is to relate the tax bills to the median household income. which is a measure of a municipality, city, or town, you might say their wealth. And the reality is that Claremont is a poor community. It's lowest in household median income in this regional planning commission territory of 27 towns. And it's near the bottom of the county. And so when you take the average tax bill and divide it and make it a percentage of household income, the burden here is near the top. Now, these are what I'm just saying is based on some preliminary information that was done by the New Hampshire Center for Public Policy Studies, and there are a lot of variables, but approximately, even though your taxes are average, your tax bill is average, if you're poor, it's more of a burden than in a place with a different configuration.
And there's no doubt that, we're the only city in Sullivan County. So when people want to move here that don't have a car, that need services, that need medical, that need, that are poor and don't have resources, they're going to move to your community. We have a lot of rental incomes here. We have a lot of people that don't own homes. So I have no idea what the percentage of people who work or on fixed incomes are in Claremont, but I would imagine that elderly and fixed incomes is a higher percentage here.
Mike Shirast, Ward 2. I'm in 1. I wanted to point out, I'm in finance, and I realize that, and I just wanted to point out to everyone that we're one of the first communities that has been reassessed since the market did what it did in 2009. And I think what we need to do is be aware that we are one of the first communities in the state that had been reassessed. And I think if we give the rest of the state some time, another year or so, 2 years, you're going to see other rates change and go up also. If a house cost $175,000, our rate was $35, give or take. If the cost of the house goes down, or the value of the house goes down to $150, then the rate went up to $45. So it's relative, and that's why the rate stays about the same. In other communities, we're going to see the same thing happen, where that number is going to go up, and there's some that will go down. I just wanted to point that out to everybody because I think it's important that we be patient.
Our 5-year window couldn't have come at a worse time. I mean, it really couldn't, but it's the way that it is.
You know, you've been waiting for me to talk. Norm Bloom, Ward 3. Abatements.
Yes.
Where does that money, I know you set your budget and everything else.
Yep.
Middle of the year, we get Water Street down here, they applied for abatements on all them buildings. Where is that funds coming from to offset that against the tax rates?
So in the first year of the budget of the abatement, it comes out of overlay. And generally, when I set the tax rate, DRA will say to me, how much do you need in overlay? And you'll see it on the tax rate handout sheet that I gave you that actually sets the tax rate. Did I pass it? Right here. Hang on a second. A little slow. If you look at that number where it says add overlay, $154,723, that's what I anticipate overlay will be. And that's generally what happens is I look at what we've paid out to date for tax abatements, and I plug that number in so that it's built into that rate. And I actually budget every year in my budget for the overlay and the war service credits, because the war service credits are a huge impact. That comes off the bottom line of people's taxes. So when I have to budget that amount in there. So I get that number from assessing. Overlay, I look at what we've actually expended when I put in my revenue report, when I'm actually setting the tax rate. And then we don't give any more abatements after that, so it's not until the following fiscal year.
I have a question. You mentioned that the budgeting, is a budget question, is done by department. And that before that, it was done by function, such as, I think I heard you say, by personnel or insurance. No, okay,
No.
so I misunderstood. What I'm getting at, though, is doing it by department, and each department has some of the same functions, like
Yes.
the salaries and the benefits, and insurance, maybe insurance, or some of the things that are common to each department, supplies, and it's hard, unless you play with your spreadsheet, to summarize similar functions across city departments in order to see what that functional cost is overall. Except I guess it's done for some of the big ones like personnel. So what I'm getting at is, do you separately roll things up by function instead of by department? But if you do, it's not in the budget document.
Right. So I can roll that up, and I can sort my spreadsheets by just salary and benefits. But when I first came to the city, what happened is personnel costs, health insurance costs, retirement costs were all in one general services area. They weren't allocated by department. So you never knew what it cost to run your fire department or your police department or your finance department, because those were all in another area. So that's almost, well, it wasn't back then, but right now it's almost $3 million. So I want to know what it cost. What does it cost to run? And it's very hard when I go to compare other communities, because some other communities still separate that out. So you really can't tell. Am I spending the same amount as a similar sized community for the police department? Or am I spending more or less? I actually have to make phone calls to find out whether they include their personnel costs in their department budget. So, because that can sway that amount significantly. A lot of people don't have their capital. So when we lease the fire truck, it's in the fire department's budget, because if I didn't have a fire department, I wouldn't need that fire truck. So that's all part of running that fire department. So if it was a bonded item and we were bonding that, that would show up in debt service and would not show up in that department budget.
Mary, can you talk a bit about contingencies? Sorry, Peg Hall, Ward 1. Can you talk a bit about contingencies? As an example, any given department might have a range of costs for something beyond their control. Let's say Public Works and how bad a winter it's going to be, how much you're going to need for snow plowing, for sand, salt. And again, following the principle of whether you overestimate, underestimate, you would tend to underestimate revenues, overestimate expenditures just enough to be safe. Are there separate contingencies within each department budget for some of those unknowns, or is that held in a single fund or line item from which each department would have to request a transfer should they exceed their expected cost that year?
So I don't have a contingency fund. Bernie had mentioned this at another one, and I met him going out saying, what exactly are you talking about? So in each department budget, I can tell you that DPW generally budgets for 10 storms a year. And Scott can, but I think that's what they calculate out for how many hours or how many storms they're going to get, major storms that are going to require X amount of salt, sand, whatever. They go by historical trends, so they'll go back over the last 5 or 6 years of what they've spent, and that's what they try to budget in their budget, is based on that. It's not like there's a separate pot that we can say, gee, we're going to take from this if you're over. If we anticipate being over, we can't overexpend the department budget without going to council and asking them to either overexpend it or to take it from someone else's department because we're going to be over. So the departments have to maintain their costs within what's budgeted.
So what do you do if the timeframes of things that you need to know just don't line up. So, for example, you don't know what next year's insurance costs are going to be, or you have a union contract that hasn't been negotiated and you're holding back. You need to make sure you've got enough money to pay salary changes that you anticipate will happen, but you don't want to announce to the world, oh, gee, we've got enough money in here for a 1% raise for these people, that kind of thing.
So fuel oil is one that I try to guesstimate, because right now I'm looking at next year's budget. I'm budgeting 15 months ahead of time for the end of the year for next year. I don't have a fuel contract for next year, so I'm going to put in my best guesstimate and hope that I'm okay with it. This year we cost more in heating fuel and stuff because it was a colder winter. So people have to squeeze from other areas of their budget if they're going to be short in fuel oil, and they have to do a line item transfer between something at their budget that they're willing to give up in order to cover the fuel costs because they're higher than they anticipated. Union negotiations are a different ball of wax. Those have to go to council individually because they're all cost items. So we have put money in a pooled account before, because of exactly what you said. We don't want them to necessarily know what we're willing to pay. But in the end, any cost items have to go to council for approval, and if we don't have enough money, we have to ask council to raise it from fund balance for that first year, and then the following years of the contract, it's actually built into the budget.
Just in answer to that, I replied to Mary when she asked what accounts, and I haven't had a chance to go through the current budget and look at those accounts that I allege are forms of reserve, forms of contingency. But I will. Any first-timers? There's a first-timer.
Yeah. Ray Gagnon, Ward 3. Municipalities are not eligible to maintain contingency reserves. Nonprofits can, but city and town governments cannot. And that's the dilemma, or that's the problem that you're dealing with. So what exactly is the budget monitoring process that you and city administration conduct regularly to make sure that you're not overspending the various line items? And maybe you could share with us some of that information.
Mm-hmm. So the code requires that I do quarterly reports to council, or more often if they wish that, and the council a long time ago wished that it would be monthly. So every month I do a finance report, and it's actually up on the website as well. And it shows all of the summary of all of the expenses and revenues, where we're short. I also put on a cover sheet for them, so that if they don't have time to dissect all of it, they can look at the cover sheet, and that is generally where I think we're doing okay and where I think we need to keep a closer eye on. So which departments are over month to date, and maybe why they're over, and some of those are because costs are front-loaded. For example, my property and liability insurance and workers' comp are all due in January. So we're 6 months through the budget, but I might be nine months through that portion of that money because I've paid it through the whole year. So that's, and contingencies, Ray, we are allowed to hold money aside for anticipated lawsuits or abatements. For example, Fairpoint has been an ongoing lawsuit. So I think I have $500,000 held aside.
I guess what I was thinking is that nonprofits,
Just a minute.
Nonprofits, for example, can take 15% and put it in off the costs right off the top and say, that's my contingency reserve. You don't have that luxury.
Correct.
Yeah, that's my point. Yeah, they're not a nonprofit, they're a government entity.
I just thought of one example. The Parks and Rec is peeling off some of their revenue to put into a repair and maintenance reserve. Isn't
Capital.
that?
It's a capital reserve. So we have capital reserves.
Aha. So you're saying you can't have operational reserves, but you can have capital reserves.
I can't just hold aside money without council approval. So when I do the audit, the councilors say to me, what kind of money do you need to withhold from fund balance to account for things that you don't know what the outcome is going to be? Generally, those are large abatements. When we had the downtown TIF, when there were the question in the courts where how much their value was, I had $350,000 set aside for that. So that in the event that I had to pay that out, I was not putting it on the property tax rate. I was taking it aside from what we had set aside for fund balance out of that. So there was $350 there. Like I said, there's still, that's been reduced from $850 to $500,000, and that's mainly for Fairpoint. So, and I think abatements, I think that, I think we maybe had 40 or 50 abatements out of 5,400 parcels. So even though we just did that reval, there weren't a lot of abatements submitted by the March 1st deadline.
Just one more thing, if you could maybe reemphasize, and that is a department may not overexpend its budgeted and approved amount without going to the council. But within each department, there are bunches of line items.
Correct.
And that the department head or the city manager or anybody in the administration, they can move stuff around within the line item.
Right.
Is that a typical municipal practice?
Yes. So, for example, vehicles, maintenance and repair, I might have $1,000 in that account. We might have a transmission go that costs $3,000. So rather than go to council and say, gee, my vehicle maintenance and repair line is overspent, we need you to raise and appropriate some more money or take it out of fund balance, what we will do is the department will say, I'm willing to forego X, Y, Z and not do that this year. That comes into play with why a lot of them will try to save money until closer to the end of the year, so that if they do have a problem, they have that money to take. So lots of times in April, May, and June, you'll start seeing RFPs to go out for things that they need to purchase or studies they need to do or items they need to buy, so that they're not caught with, oh my God, I didn't plan for that.
Now, is that restriction about, or permission, yes, you can move stuff around within line items within the department, but you can't interdepartment without council approval. Is that a matter of state law or Claremont City Charter?
Claremont Code.
So the charter or an ordinance? The
I
Claremont
don't
Code
know,
has
but-
two parts, the charter part and all the ordinances.
I don't know which one, but it's in one or the other that says that we cannot transfer between departments without council approval.
And of course, the issue is the charter is hard to change, but ordinances are much easier to change.
Yeah, but why would you want to change it? I mean, that's your, oh,
Just wondering the source of the authority.
okay.
Along the same lines, what are the policies for moving from one line item to another within a department budget? From whom do they have to, how high do you need to go to get permission, and is there a dollar amount where that changes who you have to go to? Does there come a time when you do need to get a council approval? Is there a time when you have to go to the city manager? At what level, what dollar amount can you do just by the department head say so? What are those policies?
So nothing gets changed in the budget system unless I'm doing it. And it has to, so the line item transfer forms come to me, and they have to be approved by the city manager before they're done. So it doesn't matter whether it's 20 cents.
And if it's but if it's $20,000, is there a point where it has to go to city council if it's within your own budget?
No, not if it's within their own budget.
And is that a policy, a code, or an ordinance?
I don't know, it's not,
Charter or ordinance.
Charter or ordinance?
all it says is that they can transfer lines within the department, it has to be approved by the city manager, and if it's outside the department, it has to go to city council.
But you don't know if that's an ordinance or if that's a policy.
Yeah, I don't know whether it's in the charter or the code. It's in one or the other.
I wanted to ask, something you said made me feel as though it were true that city employees are not covered by federal Social Security. Is that true?
Group 2. Group 2 are your firefighters and your police officers.
Those
and
are
your
not
correctional institutes at the county level. We don't pay payroll tax, they don't pay payroll tax, so they don't get Social Security. We do have to pay Medicare.
They don't get Social Security retirement benefits.
And we don't pay, because they're not paying in.
Okay,
So
but all other city employees get state retirement plus Social Security.
Yes, and they pay 11%, we pay for them.
And they are federal withheld, and the city not fire and police, the others, does the city pay FICA which is the federal,
Yes,
and they pay their share.
yes,
So essentially, they're covered by Social Security retirement
yes,
and also get a state pension.
yes.
But the police and the fire
No.
don't have that. Okay. Yes.
Mary, sewer and water, they're funded by users only,
Yes.
correct? My other question, if I can remember it again. Back to me, I gotta think about
Okay, we'll be back.
it. I forgot what it was.
Age has its privileges.
That comes with every birthday. Did I understand correctly amongst your notes that a handful of departments within the city actually are about 70% of the local tax rate? Did I understand that right?
You mean, is it the 70% for the union? We have 107 or 108 full-time employees, full-time, which get benefits. And 70% of them are also covered by a collective bargaining agreement. The only other number that had the 70% was the percentage of your tax dollars goes to fire, police, and public works. That's 70% of the $15.11 that you pay in per thousand.
I think what she's saying is those three departments eat 70% of the budget. Is that?
That's correct.
Follow up?
No.
Okay.
70% of the city's portion of the budget. So out of your $2,500 tax bill, almost $2,000 of it goes to fund your fire department, your police department, and your public works department.
Speaking of percentages, I'm sorry?
Equipment and people, all their expenses
Right.
and the people, not just people.
Another percentage I was interested in is what your guideline percentage is for benefits. In other words, you take someone and you know what their salary is, and you have to budget an amount. Well, of course, now that you've got the agreements, you can kind of you kind of know what the actual amount is going to be.
I do.
But before the agreements, you had to estimate a percentage of salary for benefits. What was your guideline rule of thumb percentage for estimating benefits?
I have it all broken out. So the two areas that I have that are guesstimates for me, and they will be again this year, is what is my health insurance cost going to be come January 1st of this year, which will make me halfway through the new budget. So I have to figure out, health insurance going to go up 5%, 10%? It's almost $2 million for health insurance. It's a big swing if I don't have the right number in there. The other one that I have to look at is retirement. So this year I'm good because the retirement figures go through this coming year's budget. It'll be the following year when I'm putting that number together, but now that I'm on a fiscal year, there's less guessing. But the health insurance is really the only misnomer that I don't know, and whether somebody switches from a single plan because they got married and now they have a two-person, or whether they have a new baby, and like I said, that's an $8,000 swing, which is how much on the tax rate, Bernie?
A little over a penny.
So if I have 4 people that got married, or out of my 100, I'm looking at 4 cents extra. So, and I looked at 3% on the tax rate is like $300,000 a year. So, when I start having a shift of 4 people at 8,000, there's 32,000 right there. So
do you have a estimated percent?
I don't do it by a cost of my health insurance or my unemployment, my workers' comp. I calculate all those out per person. And actually what happens is that once I've set those numbers, my departments, if they're going to be funding a new position, or if they have a vacant position right now, they will always want me to budget a family plan, and I will always budget a 2-person plan, because the onerous is on both of us. So if you get a single person, you're up $8,000. If you get a family, you need to find $8,000 in your budget. So, I can't see funding it at the highest level available because it increases my tax rate. So, I want in there what I need and what I feel we can cover. So they meet us halfway.
Back to me, Bernard.
Okay.
What I was gonna ask now. This is going to be a planning question for
Okay.
you.
I'm getting the run of the gamut of departments now.
Well, we've got 4133 as our mill rate. What do we do, or how do we go about promoting Claremont? Right now, the majority probably of the people in this town, if you got into a labor situation, they're in the poverty, and they're paying a tax rate. How do we get something to help offset that tax rate? We know that 30-something years ago, this was a prosperous community, but the prosperity's gone the other way now.
And we talked about before the show started. about
Right.
Where, we've lost manufacturing, and a lot of reasons have contributed to that, but I don't see that coming back anytime soon. But if you were going to move into this community, what would you be looking at? What would you want in a community?
If you're coming in as a manufacturer,
You need a,
you got to look at your bottom line working against what you have for a community.
but you need a workforce, correct?
Yeah.
So what manufacturer is going to come in if they don't have a skilled workforce? One of the things that we have heard from a lot of the manufacturers around here is that they can't get people who can pass a drug test. Is that a problem?
That's a major problem.
So why would you move here? Are you going to move here if you can't get a workforce? You've got to import all your workers. What's another thing you look at? You look at your schools. If you move here with kids, do you want your kids to go to a good school? So, do we have full-day kindergarten? What kind of schools do we have? You're looking at a business saying, I'm not going to move here if I don't have good schools because my workers don't want to put their kids in your schools. So it's not a one-sided stool. So, you have to have all three legs to make the stool balance. So I ran some numbers to say, okay, I think one of the questions that people are going to ask me is, how do I get the tax rate to be $21 a thousand, or half of what it is now? So I looked at it and I said, well, you'd have to bring in $413 million in assessed value. Lowe's building is maybe $5 or $7 million. So how many Lowe's buildings do you need in Claremont? It's just, it's not going to happen instantly, but cheerleading, being positive about your community, trying to sell people on why they should move to Claremont. There are a lot of great things that are happening here. It's not happening fast enough for anybody, but, looking at whether property taxes is really the choice of how we should be funding what we have for expenses, because you need a police department, you need a fire department, you need public works. If you were to cut the whole city budget and have no city services, your tax rate still wouldn't be at $21 a thousand, because we only have $15 of it, of the 41. So, you've got to have city services. It's not an easy problem to fix, and it certainly isn't instant.
I can't resist at this point giving my economic development idea. It's an industry that has many high-paying jobs. It brings visitors, spending money, and I would call it the Claremont Casino.
So we talked about, when the casinos were talking about that, we talked about, gee, Guy, could we get three of them, put them in like the Golden Triangle? Rochester's a poor community, Claremont's a poor community, and then one in the North Country because they're poor. We looked at those kind of things.
The casino tour.
Well, you just piqued my interest. Larry and I are in Concord, and in Concord right now, they're
It's a fun
trying
place
to
to
come
be.
up with a budget, and the budget is they're cutting something like half of the Department of Transportation. They're talking almost 1,000 jobs being put out to pasture. That means that your streets and your roads that are state roads are going to now become city roads and town roads. And they're going to, the cities and towns are going to pick up the price and the costs of handling that. So they're downshifting everything. Now, one of the interesting things is that Senator D'Alessandro from Manchester has the perennial gambling bill. Now, a lot of people don't like gambling, and I understand that you might not like it because of what are your own personal values. But the fact is that this gambling bill calls for 2 casinos And it calls for something like $25 million in revenue sharing, which is what you're talking about, is giving money back to the, in other words, the first, right off the top, the first 25 million would go back to cities and towns. That means Claremont would get $500,000 a year. Now, that's what's happening, and unfortunately, we're going the other way. We're talking cuts, cuts, cuts. And what cuts mean is your increase on your property taxes. And that's what's happening in Concord. So when you talk about all of this stuff, there are alternatives in the Concord agenda. It's just that no one's listening to them.
Getting back to what you're referring to, we had talked earlier about casinos.
Yeah.
3 of them.
Yeah.
Okay? And if they're built in the right situation, the Balsams or something along that line, I know the qualm in Concord by some of people down there has been, well, you're going to have all this bad side of the phase. But when you start getting into high end, there's money there. They're driving Mercedes. They're not coming in on bicycles or walking in the door and leaving the kids under the table. So, I mean, we've got to do something in this state because what money is in this state is going to everybody else's state for gambling.
Yes. I agree with you.
You know, so
another pot of money that you talk about is Northern Pass coming down. So nobody wants Northern Pass. Franklin wants Northern Pass. Let me tell you why Franklin wants Northern Pass. Because when it gets to Franklin, the assessed value of that community is going to jump by $260 million. That would reduce Claremont's taxes by at least close to 40%. So, you know, and there's no services on the school. I mean, there's no, you know, impact. Fire, police, I mean, you know, it's a building. It's where they're sheltering and passing through the electricity. So, you know, there are reasons why Franklin wants that kind of a thing. So whether that'll happen, but it's going into a poor community.
Franklin is one of the cities in New Hampshire. I'm looking at the clock, and we build this to end at 8:30, and we've got 5 minutes to go, which I'd like to make sure we use. Before we go, I would just like to tell you that budget season is coming up, and the City Council will be chewing on the budget in May. And I think I heard the mayor say that in contrast to previous years, citizens are going to be able to chime in during the consideration of each department budget. Now, this is a change if this goes. What we did last year. Okay, so it's a new, relatively new practice, because before the only shot the citizens had was at the required public hearing at the end. So the city council is loosening up its rules on letting people speak during their deliberations, which will probably make them a bit longer, but hopefully maybe people will feel that they're getting a little more participation when they're writing that check. So we've got 4 minutes. Any other first-time speakers, first-time questioners before we continue? Yes?
I should have got into politics years ago. But for what it's worth, along these same lines, the gambling casinos and so forth, I think it's way past the time the state of New Hampshire, with all due respect, gets their head out of the sand and starts thinking about when I was traveling. Everywhere I went, I had a sales tax that I had to pay. Whether it was 3% or 7%, everywhere except New Hampshire. And I think there's one other state
Yep, I think.
that doesn't have either one. Of the two, an income tax, to my thinking, is a poor way of increasing revenue, because the wealthy people would have lawyers to be able to figure out how they would not have to pay their fair share. You got big companies doing the same thing now, only they're sending their businesses overseas to eliminate having to pay taxes here in this country. But I think, in all sincerity, if the state of New Hampshire would would invest in the possibility of a sales tax, where we have 500,000 drivers come into Manchester and Nashua on certain holidays, they come in and they pay their tolls to get through the toll gate. That's fine. But how about helping the rest of us who live here permanently, like we help them when we go to Vermont, Massachusetts, anywhere you go? You're going to pay a certain sales tax, which goes into a general fund and distributed to the municipalities. I think we're past due on doing something along that line with a sales tax, where everybody pays.
So I just to chime in here. You talk about an income tax not being your choice, and it would, I don't necessarily have a thing about one way or the other, but I can tell you that with an income tax, we lose about $270 million a year, because if you live in New Hampshire and work in Massachusetts, which many people do, Massachusetts has an income tax. So if their income tax is 7%, if New Hampshire had a 2% income tax, 2% of that money would come to New Hampshire first, and 5% would go to Massachusetts. Right now, the whole 7% goes. And so does, that's right. And it's the same thing with the sales tax. I don't think that there has been anybody that has gone on vacation and said, I'm not going to buy that because they've got a sales tax. You get nickeled and dimed to death, but you don't miss it because you're nickeled and dimed to death. But those pennies all add up when they're all being collected by everybody. The other thing that's going to be a real issue is right now you've got your 2 senators fighting like hell to stop what's called the internet sales tax. Because that internet sales tax, you've got every other community, every other state that has a sales tax is not getting revenue. If you sell your stuff from New Hampshire to a place in Texas, and Texas has a 5% sales tax, we don't collect it. This internet sales tax would make everybody in New Hampshire collect every state's sales tax and then record it and send it to them. Whether it's through the state of New Hampshire to them or not, it would be an absolute nightmare. But we're little New Hampshire. There are 2 states that don't have a sales tax. Nobody really gives a damn. So if that gets passed, that's going to be a huge impact to New Hampshire. So when you look at the income tax, I think they tend to scare people because the elderly wouldn't have an income tax. They don't have income. They're retired. You know, but you would get a lot of those other people that, you know, a $5,000 tax burden is better than a $7,000 income tax bill.
I'd be afraid of the income tax option due to the fact that you got too many people.
And everybody gets scared.
Still avoid it. If you got a sales tax on everything you buy.
Right.
Everybody pays, including the guys that come in from Massachusetts and Vermont. Because when I go there, I got to pay them.
And they're driving on your roads.
Yeah.
And they're requiring your police and fire service when they get into an accident, but they're not paying anything into those coffers. So, you know, yeah, I can't say that because they do pay into meals and rooms tax.
Keep that sales tax a little bit less than the rest of the states, and people will still come.
We don't even have the ability in New Hampshire to say, okay, I think a majority of the people in the state of New Hampshire would like this, and I'd like it on a ballot so that people can vote on it. You can't do that. You've got to go through your 414 legislators and senators and get them to buy into it. And like I said earlier, we've got 5 people in Claremont that represent Claremont's needs with 400 other people down there that don't know, 4 people, excuse me, Larry, don't know that west of Concord there are states, there are cities over here that, you know, care.
We started with the budget, and we're ending with, guess what? Politics. One of the broad definitions of politics is that politics is all about power and influence. So if you want to exercise some power and influence, you gotta get involved. And hopefully this has stimulated some people to get more involved. At least you all want to know more about what's going on and how it's done. Thank you for coming, and thank you on CCTV for watching. And we hope we'll be able to have some future educational sessions on different topics as we've had so far. Thank you, Mary, for your presentation. You've covered a lot of complex material and enlightening material. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.